Thank you, Olivier, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. My task really is to introduce to you two pieces of guidance that the IPSAS board has developed, looking at these two really important areas. And really, so my role is just to introduce the pieces of guidance. I'll explain to you the sort of key areas, and then my colleagues, firstly Bob and then Ken, will actually elaborate and talk about the application of these principles in terms of reporting and more generally in terms of policy development. So before going into the two pieces of guidance, I think it's worthwhile actually just looking at the overall place that these two recommended practice guidelines, as we call them, occupy, and to position them in the context of the IPSASB conceptual framework. And as I think this has been mentioned earlier during this week, this is an important piece of work that the board has just completed after 7 years of significant input from both staff and the board. And really what it's trying to do is set the framework for the board's future work in terms of standards. So picking out just some key areas which are relevant, really taking a step right back, we're looking at service delivery in the public sector. And service delivery can comprise a number of things: actual services directly received by individuals, but also the policy context and all the broad range of things that government actually provides. And to provide those services, it raises revenue in various forms, particularly tax. So this is money that you and I actually give the government. So accountability is an extremely important concept. And certainly in the IPSASB framework, we've drawn that out more strongly. And accountability, not just in financial terms, but in terms of what services are actually being provided. So the canvas on which accountability needs to be portrayed actually needs to be larger than you would have in a conventional set of general purpose financial statements. So we talk about general purpose financial reports, the broader suite of information that goes as part of accountability and demonstrates what the entity has actually done with the resources at its disposal. Now, that broader reporting landscape is still very much evolving. If you think about a lot of the issues in private sector accounting, essentially those are the debates that have been around for quite a long while. There still are debates going on, but very much that area is settled. In terms of the broader canvas we're talking about, actually those ideas are still very much in development. And so what the board has done is develop recommended practice guidelines. So they set out best practice in the area, but at the moment the areas are still evolving. They're still new areas. So both the areas we're talking about today are new. So they set out good practice, but they're not mandatory. And so in terms of compliance, there's no need to actually state compliance with those recommended practice guidelines. That's not to say that we won't actually develop standards at a later stage, but that's where we are at the moment. So moving then to talk about the first topic, long-term fiscal sustainability. This is an area that's very dear to my heart, having actually chaired the task force on this for the 5-year duration of the project. And I'll just pick up some key elements of the objective for this first reporting practice guideline, RPG1. Key elements within the objective. We're talking about projections. This is forward data. So again, it's not the conventional backward look that you get in a set of general purpose financial statements. It's looking forward. And a lot of what we've talked about in the sessions on public finance and public financial management is about that forward look. Where are we at the moment, and what is going to happen in the future? And you have to take a different sort of time frame with government, because governments actually have the power to raise taxation revenue going forward, and that means a very different time frame that you need to look at. So sustainability, and here we're looking at the sort of longer term trends. Most governments will have a negative balance sheet. New Zealand, we've heard about, is probably one of the few that actually is in the happy position that it does actually have a positive net worth. If you're in the private sector and saw, like the UK government has, it has liabilities of £1.2 trillion, I think you might be rather worried. What this area is doing is looking at the fact that governments can have a negative balance sheet. The key is, what's the trend? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? What's the forward picture look like? Time horizons need to be longer. Government finances are influenced by big, longer-term demographic trends. What's going on in terms of the way in which healthcare improves life expectancy? What's the profile of the working population as opposed to those in retirement? And the final element I point to on the objective is stated assumptions. What we're looking at is, what decisions has government made? What do the finances look like based on the current situation? And we're also will ask in the RPG for people to explore that a bit more, to talk about scenarios. We looked at whether we should address environmental sustainability in developing the guideline. You'll note that it's actually financial sustainability that we're talking about here. Now, clearly, environmental aspects will have an impact on the finances, but in terms of actually framing this and framing it in relation to the reports, we felt it was important in terms of this project to look specifically at financial sustainability. And it does require us to look at the cash flows across all areas of the government's activity. And this diagram I'm going to display actually shows you why. If you look in terms of the left and the right, you're looking at past cash flows as opposed to future cash flows. Inflows at the top, outflows lower down. And the areas that are shaded in blue here are essentially the information that you'd see in a conventional balance sheet. That's fine, but as I mentioned, governments have the right to tax. So we need, in terms of looking at sustainability of governments, to look at those forward flows in terms of taxation and other fees and charges, and also out. And these are things that there isn't a liability recognised for, but government has a commitment to defend the country. It has a commitment to educate, to provide welfare, and so on. So those are relevant in terms of the future outflows just as much as debt repayments and so on. And in terms of looking at sustainability, therefore, you need to look not just at those activities that have already caused you to actually provide for an item. So employee pensions might be something there, provisions for example, decommissioning and so on, but those future cash flows. So how do we define long-term fiscal sustainability? Well, you see the two key elements here are meeting service delivery and financial commitments, both now and in the future. In framing this, I explained that this is a new area of reporting, and we recognise the need to actually allow entities to evolve the form of reporting, and also to be flexible according to the type of organisation that was reporting. In terms of these sorts of projections, Olivier alluded to the sorts of long-term issues, the ageing population and so on, in his introduction. And you need a wide range of types of information to draw on. So you actually need to draw on population statistics, trend analysis, and so on. We've also, in doing this, recognised that what we don't want to do is impose extra burdens if that information is already being prepared and published elsewhere. So the idea is you can draw on that. The main report may be elsewhere, but you can provide a summary in terms of the actual general purpose financial reports. And then just picking up then on the time frame, this was something that was actually quite tricky in terms of putting the guidance together, because key programs can run for very different periods of time. And also it's very different in terms of sustainability if you're looking at a national government compared to if you're looking at a local government. So we then thought, well, what are the things that influence the government's finances going forward? Well, governments can tax, so they can raise more revenue. They can spend more, they can spend less, and there's also the level of debt. So we came up with this diagram to help us think about the flexibility, if you like, and the vulnerability of governments in terms of the three different areas. So, as I said, entities can collect more tax. There are constraints on that. If you're looking at a subnational government entity, it may well be dependent on funding from the national government, from the federal government. Therefore, actually, it's vulnerable to the government changing its policy, to the government cutting back. That may limit the time frame on which you want to report. Therefore, for a national government, typically periods of 50 to 70 years might be what you're looking at. For a local government, it may well be that a period of, say, 5 years, maybe 10 years, would actually be sufficient. Similarly, services, there are expectations about what can be provided locally, so there may be a limit in terms of the extent to which the organisation can actually cut back on those without causing significant problems. And the debt dimension as well. There are limits in terms of what governments and local organisations can actually raise. So that's the guidance on long-term fiscal sustainability. I'll just briefly then move on to talk about reporting service performance. This is RPG2. Again, this is a principles-based document. We recognise that organisations are different. There are different issues they need to focus on. So it's focusing on services. It's focusing on what the entity is actually about in terms of its objectives. And has it actually achieved the objectives that were agreed and set out? So a lot of this focuses then on what's important for users and how well has the entity discharged its obligations. So it starts to get into efficiency and effectiveness. Again, because this is a relatively new area, we've developed it as a recommended practice guideline. So in terms of coverage, we actually provide some definitions of key indicators, inputs, outputs, outcomes, and actually define those for the first time. So we're actually giving a frame of reference, a way of thinking about things. And here you've got some strong links with other forms of analysis, for example, integrated reporting. When you're thinking about the business model of an organisation, actually those become very important as part of that frame of analysis. So this then ties in with some other work I've been doing at CIPFA on integrated reporting and the network that we're launching on Monday for the public sector, together with the International Integrated Reporting Council. And again, we've allowed flexibility in terms of this could be information that's specifically prepared for that general purpose financial report, or it could be presented elsewhere. That flexibility there. And, sorry, I said it's RPG2. It will be RPG3. And I've rather ambitiously put December 2014. I think actually March 2015 looks a more realistic timetable. But that's where we are in terms of that second project. So that's the two RPGs, and that's the introduction.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much for this very helpful update on this important project. I think Bob and Ken, you're the practitioners here, and I was wondering whether you may be having a question for Jan on this project. Bob, would you want to go first, maybe?
Yeah, just to bring this to a practical level, do you have any awareness of examples where fiscal sustainability information is being used for decision making?
Yes, I think there are a number of areas, a number of examples where that's actually happening. I mean, in my own jurisdiction, we have the Independent Office of Budget Responsibility, and it is actually preparing and publishing annual long-term projections on the UK public finances, and that is now being used by the UK government as a feed into the way in which it manages the public finances. I think as well in terms of projections, broadening it out, the European Commission also collects that data, and that is becoming particularly important in terms of the long-term sustainability of the European government finances. So those indicators are collected each year. And then I think you also have other examples of other governments that are seeing the use of this data.
And Ken, from your perspective, you have a question on the RPG as well?
I was wondering, looking at the UK experience, where you've had issues in terms of the resources and capabilities and actually putting the effort into producing these reports.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does, it is quite demanding. This is not the sort of skill set that all accountants would have. It does draw on other disciplines. I've referred to long-term population projections, also projections in terms of payments out on employee pension schemes. So you need the financial statement information to build off certainly the UK experiences. We build off our whole of government accounts balance sheets. And the long-term projections by the OBR are actually published at the same time as whole of government accounts. So you need those statistical projections. You obviously need modelling because we're looking at cash flows going out over the future. And also you need economic and policy analysis to understand the impact of policies. So all of that needs to actually come together. So there's quite a complex set of information that's actually required, but the value is actually that longer term picture. And certainly coming back to the practical application of this, if you look in the UK Office of Budget Responsibility report, it shows that in this particular case, the government is projecting to come back into revenue balance in 3 or 4 years' time. And that looks good, but then actually if you look further out, maybe 10 years after that, actually there is more of a challenge coming through because of the aging population. So you can see that if the policy settings aren't changed, then the government will start to run deficits again and the level of debt will start to rise again.